All right, sorry if I look a little bit tired. It's 10 o'clock here, and it was a pretty long day of teaching, but I'm pretty happy to be there. So my name is Maxime Polleri. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Laval University in the province of Quebec. And today I'm going to talk about the politics of revitalization after Fukushima. So most of my work on Fukushima has examined the governance of radioactive contamination after the disaster. And the kind of main argument I have is that after this disaster, we are seeing one dominant practice of governance around radiation hazard, which has coalesced around what I call politics of revitalization. And like many of you already know, this is the politics that emphasize narratives of minimal or no radiation related dangers, tropes of resilience for the population, an emphasis on repatriation to Fukushima over long-term evacuation, and also restarting of nuclear power plants throughout the archipelagos. So this is a politics that is also very different from other nuclear related narrative. If we think, for instance, about the politics of victimization that followed Chernobyl, or also other cases of radiation related exposure, which are not nuclear disaster, but linked with atomic testing. So we can think, for instance, about case studies in French Polynesia or the Marshall Islands, which were often epitomized in the politics of secrecy or politics of victimization. So my main question was that I was really interested in understanding why are we seeing this very specific politics of revitalization after Fukushima. And I'm interested in understanding the kind of broader social cultural factors that enable this narrative to gain predominance over other narratives. And in a way, it's a little bit similar to the phenomenon of radioactivity, which is basically, an unstable element that gradually become more stable and emits radiation in process. So similarly, I was interested in understanding the kind of factors that have made a kind of unstable crisis transform into something that is more stable. So as I said, I'm a social cultural anthropologist. What we do is usually field work. So that means that we go on the place, we talk with people. And to answer my question, I've looked at diverse strategies, the historical factors, and also the social cultural logics that enable this politics of revitalization to thrive over other one. So it's been mostly long-term field work from 2015 to 2017. I've not been back to Fukushima since 2019, and I look forward to do so with MITATE's lab in the future. Fieldwork was mostly in Fukushima and Tokyo. Lots of interview with different people, lots of participation, observation of activities. So it was a multi-site field work with state bureaucrats, with citizens, with scientists, with farmers, and so on, and with people that were both for the revitalization of Fukushima and also with people that were against it, and not necessarily trying to judge where they were, what they were saying, but rather trying to understand where are they coming from. So the first thing that I did was to do a kind of historical background, to do a small study of the background that led to the disaster. So looking, for instance, at the post-World War II secrecy around Hiroshima and Nagasaki, studying the Atom for Peace that we saw after World War II. Also looking at the creation of the nuclear safety myth, the Genshiryoku Hanzen Shinwa. We can see a little picture of her friend Pluto-kun, which was used in education. Looking also the controversies that surround Lodo exposure, not just in Japan, but throughout the world. Looking also at how, unfortunately, there was sometimes production of furans in this context. And basically, my argument is that there was former historical and political context that have facilitated a politics of revitalization way before the disaster actually happens. So historical and political contexts that were not only created in Japan, but also created internationally, which have helped politics of revitalization happen in the event that a huge nuclear disaster will occur. Another important aspect of my work has been to look at, what is an expert? What is expertise after this disaster? So as most of you know, there was a huge crisis of expertise after this disaster. And I've looked at how the governance of radiation hazard also involved the management of expertise. Who can come to speak as an authoritative experts? So I've done a lot of participant observation in state-sponsored conference, looking at, what kind of disciplines counts as expertise, who is invited to come, how do they talk about risk, what is not being talked upon. And what I realized is that the successful politics of revitalization was also inseparable from governing who can come to speak as an expert. And being a proper expert is also a political issue, which is mediated through sociocultural pressure, reified culture of science, or state-approved recovery policies. After that, I've also looked a lot at the rise of citizen science. So as you can see on this picture, we basically had citizens with no prior knowledge of radiation that became very interested in creating their own network in measuring radiation by themselves. So I've looked at how these citizens were often dissatisfied with state expertise, have dealt with radioactive contamination themselves via citizen science. I've looked at what created a lack of trust. I've ably focused on, for instance, self-evacuee mothers who had used citizen science for politics of victimization and for trying to evacuate children from Fukushima. And I've also looked at the many difficulties that these women have faced in trying to legitimize their voice as authoritative narratives. And what I've realized is that we're often dealing with two kinds of citizen science after Fukushima. On the one hand, citizens who use citizen science to promote tropes of evacuation have mostly failed. But those who use it to revitalize Fukushima are either tolerated by the government or supported. I've also looked a lot on monitoring and decontamination practices. And I've looked at how state-sponsored program of radioactive monitoring and decontamination in the urban and rural area of Fukushima. And what I did was a kind of small comparative studies where I contrasted radiation monitoring and decontamination on paper or in the laboratory with the live experience of people who had come back to decontaminated areas. So mostly farmers, often people that were very old, but that wanted to come back to their native lands. And many of these farmers were, in fact, very dissatisfied by the state-sponsored radioactive tracking and the decontamination practice. And here I'm not arguing that decontamination doesn't work. I'm not arguing that decontamination doesn't have real effects. But as a social cultural anthropologist, I'm also arguing that monitoring and decontamination serve also a symbolic function. So they have a symbolic purpose because they also enable the state to lift restriction on the evacuation area, legitimize a repatriation policy. They create narratives of control. They create narratives of containment, which have a lot of symbolic power. So right now I've talked a lot about how we can govern a disaster by tracking radiation and so forth. But another very important aspect is if in governing a disaster, we also need to govern a very specific imaginary. And I've looked at how the Japanese states have often tried to govern the rural imaginary As many of you know, Fukushima is a very rural place where agriculture was very important. So I've looked at the Japanese state attempt to also manage the understanding of radioactive hazard and recovery beyond technical fixes and beyond scientific discourses. So specifically, I focus on how the Japanese states have often mobilized tropes of nostalgia for one native lands. So what the Japanese call the furusato, so the kind of native land which is deeply tied to a feeling of nostalgia. And what I did again was to do a kind of comparison between the way the state talk about the furusato, about the native land, and the way that, for instance, evacuee or former people that came back to Fukushima talks about their furusato. How different understanding of the furusato are influencing the interpretation of radioactive contamination. And often people that came back to Fukushima, even if they're back in the same exact location, they're not exactly back in the same place because the whole culture of the place has changed a lot. So the furusato has kind of disappeared a little bit in that way. It will never be what it used to be. I've also looked at controversies that surround the interplay between nuclear energy and radioactive contamination. So as you know, nuclear power was shut down after the disaster, which created a lot of controversial talks about the future of energy in Japan. And what I did was to analyze a set of public controversy that surround the role of nuclear power and the threat of radioactive contamination within the very powerful Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. So in these public conference, I've looked at how the generic language of uncertainty was often deployed to render incommensurable risks commensurable. For instance, energy risk, financial risk, health risk, in order to create a kind of hierarchies of urgencies. So, for instance, global warming as being more important than the potential adverse health effects of low-dose radiation. So the future of energy as being more important than evacuation. So these kinds of hierarchies. And now these kind of hierarchies often depoliticize debates around radiation danger. So what we have in a nutshell is a hierarchization of uncertainties that act as a very effective tool to manage controversy surrounding energy and residual contamination. I've also looked at the teaching of radiation after 3/11. Me and Cecile are working on a piece about this, which we hope to publish in the near future. What I've looked is a complementary approach to risk communication, where state expertise about radiation hazard has been increasingly disseminated to the public via teaching infrastructure that are very cute, so very kawaii, jargon-free, fun, interactive, cute, and amusing. And this takes, for instance, we can find this in museum, in manga, and so on. And the argument that I make is that while those state-sponsored exhibits make information on radiation very easy to understand, they also at the same time normalize certain controversy of a raised threshold of exposure by precisely concealing certain aspects of radiation danger. So they don't just teach about science, they also perform a very specific narrative. They attempt to diffuse societal unrest, they attempt to pacify fearful publics, and they also attempt to reclaim political control and economic stability. So lastly, I want to talk about the co-option of citizen science. So I've already talked about how, for instance, evacuee matter have tried to use citizen science to evacuate and have mostly failed in doing so. But there's also another facet of citizen science, and I've looked at how certain aspects of citizen science can also contribute to reinforce this politics of revitalization, while sometimes being co-opted by the Japanese states or by nuclear lobbies that have their own very vested interests. So in that regard, citizen science echoes a kind of neoliberal shift in the management of contamination. which leads to reduced public expenditure, minimal government intervention, and risk privatization. So in a nutshell, what we're saying is a delegation of risk onto the shoulder of victims themselves. So this is a kind of double-edged sword empowerment. While monitoring capacity provide a better picture, it can also be used to shift states' responsibility. So this is my research in a nutshell. If you're interested, I have a bunch of papers, peer review publication that you can see on my website. And I look forward to hopefully speak with you face to face in the near future. So thank you very much.